gave this talk for the first time a little over a year ago. And I guess one of the things I'm trying to show is that, the better you get with the query tool, the more you're going to be able to take on these giant problems that you face inside here. So also, this area that we're about to look at, M programming, there isn't a lot of resources out there. If you want to learn DAX, first of all, there's the two Italian guys, Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari. You read their books, you know everything about it, and there's tons of other resources on DAX. You get to M, and you're going to find there's 7 blog entries, by Chris Webb, and that's pretty much it.
Well, no, there's Brian Grant.
Brian Grant, okay. But I learned so much from these 3 guys right here. So Matt Mason works on the team in Microsoft with Power Query, and he's one of the ones that's kind of driving things forward and evangelizing. There's a guy named Chris Webb out of the UK, who is what I think of is the leading third-party expert in Power Query and working with them. And then another fellow from down under, Rezarad. Okay, so just want to call out to them.
We got nothing on Brian.
Nothing on Brian? Okay.
I like Reza.
Can we get him in an M suit up here? Okay. Also, everything I'm doing here, there is a GitHub repository. If you go there, you'll be able to download these slides. You'll be able to download the samples inside here. Okay, so we're going to cover, first of all, just the Power Query mashup engine, talk about what that is. And one of the things that we're going to look at is that when you use Power Query, quite often we just stay within the user experience and we click here and click there and we kind of create these query transforms. But there's also the ability, to go in and work directly with M code. And so one of the things I want to bring out, is that, there are certain advantages, and certainly there's a lot more that you can do if you work directly with the M code. So we're going to look at M just as a new programming language. I know not all of you are developers, but let's kind of start out with this tool. And if I go ahead and I bring up Power BI Desktop. So how many people use Power BI Desktop? Okay, just kind of seeing, hoping everyone in the room raises their hand here. Let's say I want to do something fairly straight ahead. So I bring up this new project. Now, one of the things I have here is this CSV file. So I'm going to use NFL teams in this example. And so one neat thing about NFL teams is they all have a web page that has a roster. So let's say that I get inside here and I grab this. So if I just bring up a browser, and I go to this particular page right here, we should see there is a page, and sooner or later there's going to be an HTML table. But what we want to do is we don't care about the UI. We just want to go and scrape the data from this HTML table inside there.
The Bengals then?
Yeah, I know.
Okay. I like the Giants. I tend to like teams that are at the bottom.
It doesn't matter who you bring up. It's going to be controversial.
Okay. Oh, Portland doesn't like football. I forgot. Okay. Should have something. I should have had soccer examples inside here. But let's say we go to web. And so now I go through here and I enter this inside. And so there's this neat experience, where behind the scenes they're doing all kinds of things like looking at that particular page and determining, what are the HTML tables, and they're going to bring up this navigator. So the one that I want is going to be the first HTML table, it's the one that's named active. And so we're going to go ahead and say edit inside here. Power BI Desktop also has this kind of unfortunate bug that the query editor is not there. It is, it just doesn't become the active window, so we need to go through. But now that we have this inside here, what are some of the things, that I might want to do? So I might want to go through and start, changing some of the columns inside here. Here, one of our main jobs that we have when we create queries is to clean the data. And if you have data that's supposed to be numeric and you don't convert it and it's text-based, all of a sudden you can't sum, you can't average. All you can really do is count. So one of our main jobs is to make sure that these things are all being converted. So if I have weight inside here, let's go through here and we'll put in weight. Age looks like it's already fine. If I look down here at experience, this is the number of years that a player has been in the league, but instead of giving rookies 0, they give them an R. So this could convert into a number. So the tool is going to let me do something such as do a replace value, find everything is an R, and replace it with a 0. And now I can go through here and I can go ahead and convert that to a whole number, and now I've done my conversion inside there. Okay, now let's go back to the slides for a second. So we have this tool, and it's all about going to different data sources, be it SQL, be it big data, it's in CSV files, or web services. I'm able to connect to multiple data sources, and there's this engine. So this isn't DAX, this is the query engine, which is called the mashup engine inside there, and that's what basically runs my queries and pulls the data back and dumps it inside of the data set. Now, when I wrote this, M code was just good to create data sets. Microsoft has now introduced data flows, which give us yet another place where everything that we're going to learn tonight, we can use. The idea of a data flow is that you want to stage the data, and you might have a lot more data than you can fit in a Power BI data set. It might be 100 gigs worth of data. You can never load that in. But we just want to pull the data down, cleanse it, transform it, and then kind of put it in Azure storage, where I can basically store as much data as I want because data is cheap. So whether you're pushing data into a data flow or into a data set in Power BI, the query tool and the mashup engine, is going to be your friend. So what many people do is they use this query editor window. And you can see that as I was creating this query right here, we started with, there was this one particular page that had a bunch of tables, and as I picked a table and then I changed different types and I changed things inside there, it was able to go through and do the work. Now, these applied steps are things where there's an instruction that when I click and I create a new step, there's a piece of code, that's written. And so, every one of these steps, has a piece of code that's written behind in a language which is called M. My understanding is they basically created a language called M as kind of the cool code name, and then no one had any ideas how to create the real name, so M just kind of stuck. And I guess there's other languages like R with one letter, so. Also, it's called the Power Query Formula Language, if you look at the specification for this. Now, if I go back here in the tool and I go to view, note that I can bring up the formula bar and see the M code or make it disappear. So there are two kinds of users. Those that like M code, those that want to ignore their family and friends, and there's nothing I'd rather do than write code. And then the other extreme is I don't want to see the M code because my head will explode. So the tool was really made for both audiences. So certainly there's going to be lots of people that just want to hide this and just use the tool, click, click, click. But what we can see is that for every single step here, that the tool generated M code, and if I go to the advanced editor and I bring this up, here's the code that's actually stored, and when they run your query, this is the code that goes against that mashup engine and executes. Okay, so what we're going to do is kind of just look at the language and talk about why we might want to get more involved. Now, the first time you might come into contact with this is that you want to use something like a custom column. So here's an example of a custom column. So you kind of saw that I was able to take, things like experience, and just using the tool, I was able to replace the R with a 0 and then convert. Okay, great. How about this other thing down here, where we have the height, 5'10", 6'4". How the heck am I going to average that? So let's kind of start by, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to basically say, let's go ahead and split, by a delimiter. And a year ago, Power BI Desktop wouldn't be smart enough to see in the data that there was a hyphen. Now it is, so I don't have to do much. I'll just go ahead and choose OK. But now I have, one column for feet, and then I have, one column for inches inside here. And so now what I want to do is I want to create a custom column. And I want to be able to find what is the height in inches. So we go to add column. We now go to custom column. And so what we'll do is we'll create something which is called height. And now I've got to write M code. Luckily the M code here is not going to be all that challenging, because I'll open up a parenthesis and then I'll say let's take the number of feet and asterisk times 12 plus the number of inches, and let's go ahead and choose OK. And now you can see that we have the number of inches. Note that when you do this, if I ever look up there and I see ABC 1, 2, 3, it means it couldn't determine what type it is, so it's of type any. And generally you want to convert to a specific type rather than having any inside there. But now you've kind of seen the first place where you might have to write M code is that you have a custom column. Okay, now the second thing is we can also use the advanced editor. So let's say that I have this query inside here, and notice that when I created the query, and I go back, I can't even remember, okay, this was the Giants, so let's go ahead and rename this one to the Giants. And now I want to create a second and a third and a fourth query, but I don't want to have to click, click, click each time. So one of the things that we can do is we can go back to the advanced editor window. Once I get there, I'm simply going to take all this code and copy it. Let's now create a new query. So if I go down here and say, give me a blank query, they give you, it's absolutely a blank query. For various reasons, they probably should just bring up the advanced editor window here. But now let's go ahead, take that, and paste my work in. And now all I really got to do is kind of figure out, what is, the URL inside here. So if I now go back here, okay, I guess everyone probably hates the Eagles, even if you don't know about football. You hate the Philadelphia Eagles. But now let's go ahead and kind of put that inside there. So for people who are kind of willing to work, at this level of working with the M code, moving things back and forth, and lots of other things that we do, are just going to be a lot faster inside there. Okay, now what we want is we want more advanced editors. Now once again, I wrote these slides a year ago, so back then you can use Notepad++, and there's one guy who kind of put an extension in to make that work. Visual Studio Code also has mQuery extensions, and you can use what we're going to show here at the end is that there is a Power Query SDK. Now, one wonderful thing that happened recently with Power BI Desktop, let me go ahead and close the query tool for just a second. And now I'm going to go back, and there's this preview feature where now, instead of just seeing the advanced editor with a dumb text box that doesn't have color coding or IntelliSense, let's go back up here to options. Let's go to preview features, and there is now M IntelliSense. Once again, it's in preview. Probably will go to GA sometime over the next couple months. So I set that. I'm going to go ahead and close, and I better go ahead and give this a name. I'll just kind of call this NFL. But once you change the preview features, you have to close and reopen Power BI Desktop. And now that we have done this inside here, let me go ahead and open that project one more time. And so we'll open the query editor window. And now when we go to the advanced editor, now we got the color coding inside there. And you'll also see that if I go to something like table, and I say table dot, this takes us way ahead of where we used to be, where you just had to write the code and hope it worked. Okay, so now we have a better editor that's just kind of built into Power BI Desktop. Now, why would you learn M? Many people, the answer is going to be no good reason. I'm just going to keep using Power Query as it is. But what you'll see is that I'm going to show you a technique where we use something called a query function that just adds an amazing amount of power. To me, that would be your first motivation of kind of learning things at this level. You want to perform calculations across rows. We're going to show some examples. But other things would be I attach to a SharePoint list. And what they do, in the code that comes out of the box is that they figure out what is the GUID of that particular list, and they hard code that in. In SharePoint, I often use this technique where if you want to take a list with 10,000 items and delete every item, you got to do it one by one. It's going to take hours to do that. Or you can just drop the list and recreate it. And you can recreate the list with the same title, but it's going to have a different GUID, so it breaks. So you could basically jump in and kind of change the dependency from the GUID of the list to the title. And once again, just another example of a technique where if you learn to work with an M, you can get there. And if you're reliant just on the the UI experience, you can't get there. Okay, another reason might be that we have the same query logic and I want to use it across 10 different Power BI desktop projects. So writing the M code, putting it in a source file and checking the source control, means that I can now take that code out and copy and paste it into 10 different projects. So it gets to be a good way to, have, golden query logic that you want to use across projects. Okay, and stay ahead of the pack. So let's go ahead and kind of look at some of the, fundamentals of working with M. So it is a functional programming language, and if you program with VBA or you program with VB or C#, they're procedural languages. So the idea of a functional language is that you will write a series of functions that basically get evaluated. And I'll write function 1, which calls function 2, and when we evaluate function 1, it has to evaluate function 2 and then evaluate function 1. But what we're going to see is we're going to basically write a bunch of different expressions instead of writing statements. Now, every query, is a single expression that returns a single value. And that might not mean a lot now, and hopefully, after half an hour of talking about this and looking at the language, that will start making sense. Also, every query that you write has a return type. Now, just getting started, M is case sensitive. So if you have uppercase versus lowercase and you get it wrong, it's not going to work. It's all about writing expressions. And then also, when you write a query, it can reference other queries by name. So let's kind of start with something easy inside here, and that is, let's say I go back here, and I want to create a new query. So I'll say, give me a blank query inside here, and I'll put something like, the number 2 inside here. Notice that most of the queries that you have, look at the icon, it's a table. So when we start using it, we just kind of expect every query to return a table, but now I have a query that returns a 2, and you can kind of see the type inside there. If I, change this to something else, so we're going to put something like hello inside there, and notice that changed to A, B, and C. So every query, has a return type. Let's go back to query 1, and in query 1, I'm going to let me just, for this simple demo, I'll create a new query. So here we'll create another blank one, and this one we'll put world inside here. So this is query 3. And now let's create query 4, and let's kind of put things together. And what you can see is that if I call query 1 inside of another query, so back here, we'll go ahead and create yet another query. And now, inside here, we're going to reference other queries by name. So there is query 2, and then when I want to parse things together, we're going to use the ampersand, and we'll put a space in there, and now we'll have query 3 inside here. And what we should be able to do is to put, thank you very much, put that equals in front of there, and then all of a sudden you can kind of see we get things working correctly inside there. Okay, so when you start referencing queries by name, things start working. Now, the other thing we have is this thing which is called a let statement. So when you want to write things that are more complex, you have let, and then you have this series of, I kind of think of them as variables that you're creating. var1 equals hello world, var2 equals, var3 equals, I want to bounce something to uppercase. And then the let statement, the idea is we start by evaluating what's at the very bottom in. And quite often, to evaluate that, it has to come back up here and evaluate this, which triggers the evaluation of this. Okay. But remember, this is a single M expression that returns a single value. So there might be lots of different calculations of individual expressions inside there as it calculates the final value of this statement. Now, also you can see that when I write this kind of code and I create a variable 1, variable 2, and it's got an expression, if I look at applied steps, I can see those kind of match up to what's inside there. Now here's where things get a little bit ugly. We can either have the M code ugly, or we can have the user experience ugly. So what's going to happen here is that if I want to have a step or a variable, and I want there to be spaces inside to make it more readable, the language says you can do that, but you got to do some extra stuff. So in particular, if your variable doesn't have a space, it can just have the name and the M code's a lot prettier. If you have a space, you have to then say # and put the variable name in quotes inside there. But you can see that I can now create one that's really long, and I can start referencing those things inside there. Now, when I said one side has to be ugly or the other, when you have spaces, the applied steps looks a lot prettier because you can have spaces inside here. So when you're using the tool, they err on the side of making the M code a lot more messy by putting spaces inside there, but then forcing, they have the, that extra # and quotes around there.
So Ted, do you believe that spaces and variable names are evil?
Yeah, but I don't think evil is bad. Is that the right answer?
It's an answer.
You can also use underscores in?
You can use underscores, so it's really
To
just,
avoid having
well,
to-
there's a series of characters, but underscores.
And I think it's the same requirement.
But as you go back to the UI and you click, 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 it's going to be creating these things that have the #. So if I take over a script and I know I just want to write by hand, I'll get rid of the spaces and get rid of the # and the quotes just to make the script look a lot cleaner as you're writing M code. But it's one side or the other. Now, if we look at this right here, here's kind of a common scenario where I've written a query and I have, going down here. And so when this is evaluated, the first thing they do is they evaluate output. But in order to evaluate output, they then have to go up and evaluate, text upper, and now text upper var3, they have to evaluate var3. var3, to calculate its value, we have to calculate what's the value of, var1 and var2. So in order to calculate output, there's this trigger that basically evaluates var1, then var2, then var3, and then output. So everything gets evaluated, and then they return, a single value back. Now, here's an interesting one. If you look at this code, var1, var2, var3, output, let's say I took my things and I reversed them. Will this code work?
Yes.
Yeah, and this code will absolutely work. Will this code confuse the heck out of the UI experience? And the answer is absolutely yes. So if you want to just go into M code and do nothing but write M code, this is fine. So the order of expression in the let block doesn't matter to the mashup engine, but it will confuse this tool, and then you won't be able to kind of go back and use the UI portion anymore. Okay, next thing is that when I start writing M code, there's this really valuable principle of query folding. And the idea of query folding is that if I'm writing a query and I say connect to that SQL box, and then the very next step I say, let me choose columns. I don't want every single column. I don't want select star. I want select column 1, column 2, column 4. So right after I have the first statement that gets the data from the database, well, then I have select columns, and then I have a select rows. So the mashup engine is smart enough to say, hey, we're getting rid of some columns, we're getting rid of some rows, why bring everything back? So the idea of query folding is it can create a single SQL statement that selects only the columns that you want and has a where clause to only bring back the rows that you want. So in general, query folding is a very important concept, and we like that inside there.
Does that get broken though when you start doing certain things in M code so that query folding efficiency stops at a certain point?
Yes, absolutely. So that's some of the things we have to worry about. For instance, there are some things that would stop query folding from being able to occur. So then if you put your where clause down below that, it has to bring back all the data and then kind of apply the filter locally. And obviously, if we bring back 10,000 items to filter down to 100, that's not efficient. So generally, we want to have all the things that support query folding up at the top as close as possible. Okay. Now, some data sources support folding. And generally, it's relational databases and OData data sources that support query folding inside there. Okay, what happens when the data source doesn't support query folding? It just has to bring back all the data and basically, do the extra work, in memory wherever you're pulling the data back to. Okay, what affects the way that query folding works? The way we structure M code, privacy levels can also affect that. And then also, you're able to do native query execution. I just want to write my SQL statement and push that through. If you're ever using native SQL statements, query folding won't happen. But then the converse is, if I'm writing my own SQL statement, I probably got my columns and where clauses inside there, so I'm bringing back the exact data that I want. So I've kind of got the same effect of query folding just by writing the SQL statements inside. So here's an example. I have the SQL database, and I connect to the database inside there, and I'm going to say items equal customer. So that basically, when I connect to this database, that's the name of a table. There's my select rows. There's my select columns. I can also rename columns. So these are the main things that support query folding. And then what you're going to see is that the mashup engine's not going to create the SQL statement until all these are done, and it's able to take everything inside of each of those and create a single SQL statement that brings back exactly what I want. Okay, now I might want to use native queries. So note that in the previous slide, if you say source item equals customers, there's an entity or a table that you're connecting to. And so here we're doing something a little bit different. We're saying query equals SQL. I'll put together a SQL statement. So once again, if you have anything afterwards that's filtering or selecting columns, it's not going to work. So native queries, never include any query folding. And if you're going to use these, I won't use them, as my first choice. You might find some scenarios where you have to, or you need to call a stored procedure. So there are cases where we find ourselves, this is our only choice. But in general, if you just let the mashup engine work with tables and let it figure out the SQL statements, generally that is what's preferred as you're creating things inside there. Now, let's look at the type system. M is just a programming language, just like VBA, C#, other languages. So it has types. We've seen that if it can't figure out what the type is, it's of type any. Sometimes we get back values that are unknown. So there's null, logic, true or false, number, text, and binary. Now we also have data types for time, and that second one should be date, not data. But time, date, date time with the time zone built in, and also a duration. And then there's complex types that we're going to look at. So one of the things that I might want to do is work with lists, or work with a record, or if I have a list of records, I have a table. So list, record, table, and function are also types inside the language. If I go back here, you can kind of see the return type. That's table because of the icon. This one right here, is a number inside here. If I want to create something 1, 2, and we get the right character inside there. Let's see if I can finally get the correct character inside. Basically we're able to create lists. Now, there's also user-defined types. And the idea is that you have something like a table structure and you want to define a type. We'll see that in just a second. But here's writing M code, and here's a number, here's a Boolean. So true and false are both keywords in the language. If I want to create a list inside here, I basically just have something that is inside the curly braces. That's going to be seen as a list. One other thing, let me spin back here to this. Notice that when you write a let statement, when you're writing this code by hand, every single expression in the let block has to have a comma behind it, except for the very last one. So that's going to trip you up when you do this. You're going to copy some things out, and you'll forget the last one has a comma where it shouldn't, or one of these doesn't have a comma. Okay. So now that we've seen that, let's go a little bit further inside here. And here's an example of initializing variables for time, or date. And you see that there's functions that have the pound sign built in, so pound time, pound date, and I can initialize dates and times with that. Also, let's create a list. So if I create this list, think of a one-dimensional array. So I basically have a string array of 3 elements inside. So when I create this variable right here, I can also use this syntax right here where I specify the list, and then I say I want the first element, sub 0, sub 1, sub 2 inside here. And that's going to allow me to kind of pull things out of a particular list. Now, also, what you'll find is that here, we only have 3 elements, so the index goes from 0 to 2. So what's going to happen when I say rat pack 4? That's going to be an error. However, there is this syntax right here where if I have something that result in an error, but then I basically put the question mark behind it, it basically says if there's nothing there, don't give me a runtime error, just return a null. So quite often we kind of write that code, to be protective and make sure that our queries don't blow up. Now, here's an interesting, example. This is one that Chris Webb came up with, and that is, what's something that I have to write M code for I can't do through the UI? So let's say that there's this issue where we keep pulling back data from the database, and our gosh darn users keep adding things, like the pound sign or the @ sign, it blows up. So one of the things that I could do is I could write a fairly simple a query just using the UI, not having to write M code. It basically says, find the pound sign and replace it with a blank string, and find the @ sign and replace it with a blank string. The problem is I can't think of what people might do in the future. So instead of creating the list to exclude things, why don't we come up with the list of what to include? So what we can do is I can basically say set 1, and also this is kind of a tricky way to do a list where I say give me everything from this to that. So now this is going to give me all the capital letters A through Z. This is going to give me all the lowercase letters A through Z. And now I can do something like this, list transform. I'm hoping I'm not stealing the thunder of who's going to come next. But now I get 0 through 9. And now what are the other characters that I want? And now here's all the characters I allow. And now we'll say text select. And it looks through strings and any characters that I haven't added in are automatically excluded inside there. So once again, there's kind of a practical example of something that if I'm willing to work with the M code, we can kind of get done. Okay, now the next thing we want to look at is records. So remember when I work with a list, we use the curly brace. So what is a record? Just like a record in a database. It's a single set of data, typically for one particular entity that has fields. And so if I open the square brackets and say first name equals and last name equals, well, now I have a record. Now, when you want to access things within a record right here, you can kind of see that I'll say person, and then inside the square brackets, I reference the field name inside there. So now that we have lists and we have records, what's the next thing we want? A list of records. Okay, now, another reason that we might use records is that there are certain functions that we like to call. So web.contents is a good example. Because when I call web.contents, I pass the URL, there is a second options parameter. But for me to pass something there, I have to be able to create records because it takes a record as the argument. So here, when I pass this, I'm going to create the options record and the headers equal. And what is the headers equal? It's another record. Here, we're going to take a record and bury it inside of another record, so I can basically pass that as a parameter. Now, one other thing I want to note is that when you call web.contents, it basically generates an HTTP request, goes across the network. And one of the things that you can do, kind of dropping down to the developer level stuff, is that you can start putting headers, named headers, in the request that goes out. So here, if I say accept equals, well, now I've got a record with the accept, and this just gets translated, into the HTTP request, header variables that are going inside there. And there's one which is OData max version, and because this has the hyphen inside, I've got to basically put it, inside of the pound sign and things inside there. But there's just a practical example of I want to call web.config, I want to have more options, I have to be able to, create records, to be able to pass those parameters inside there. Okay, now here's a couple other things. You have this thing called the concatenation operator. So it's pretty obvious with a string what that's going to do. But look what it can do if I have this list. It has one element, then I have another list, and I basically concatenate them together. It just kind of gives me a union, one list that has all the elements of both lists. And also I have a record that has A, and I have another record that has B, and I merge them together, and then I get one record with both those fields. So quite often when you're taking data from multiple places and merging it together, the tool is kind of creating, this type of logic behind the scenes. And sometimes, you want to be able to get to the point where you can write this type of logic inside there. Okay, now let's look at tables. So let's say at first, we'll just kind of hard code in a table by hand. So customers table, table from record, and then I just basically have a bunch of records there that have first name and last name. You can kind of see the output inside. Actually, at this point, let me also go back to this demo, and instead of using this file, I'm going to open up a demo file. So as part of the demo files, we have one which is called Introduction to M Programming. And when you open this up, you're going to see that there's really nothing in the report other than a message saying everything lives up in the queries here. But now if I open this up right here, so this is something that you can open up, and now you can kind of start looking at some of the things inside here, and kind of seeing how we can start working with some of these inside here. For instance, there is the simple list. Also over here, you can kind of see the different icons. If it's a list, you're going to get this icon. If it's a table, you're going to get this icon inside here. And so, if I open this up, there's my table that I've gotten back inside there. Okay, now going a little bit further here, these table columns, are not strongly typed, because when they come back, it says, what is the type? Any. Don't like that. I could go through by hand and convert the types, but if I'm writing the M code, I might as well figure out, how to write the M code so that my columns, have strong typing inside there. So here's how you could do that. You can create a user-defined type. So here we've created this type called customer record type, and all I do is I basically define, I have a record that has a first name and a last name column, and both of those are of type text. I could create other columns, of type number or type Boolean inside there. And now what I can do is I can say I want to have a type which is a table, which is composed of this record type inside here. Now, kind of putting this, into a more practical set here, let's go here and I create the type of record that I want, and then I create the type of that. And now down here, when I say add table, I say customer table type. So now I've defined, what the column types are going to be. So that's how you can basically create strongly typed columns, as you're writing your M code inside there. Okay. Now, the next thing I want is to discuss something which is called Unary functions. Now, if I kind of do the long-winded way first, you have table select rows, you have this customer table, and then what you want to be able to do is kind of do a for each, so you have this kind of row, and then you have this operator right here. And so what I want to do is I want to select rows, I want to filter, and so you basically write a function here that looks at the rows, and if the customer ID, is either equal to or less than 10, return it. So here's kind of how I could do the long-winded way, and you kind of see that you put a table inside here. Here's the thing I want to filter, and then here is a function that we run on each row to come out with a true or false of whether to include that row in the set or to exclude it from the set. Okay, now watch how the syntax, gets easier. Maybe not quite as understandable, but now this is the exact same code, just with different syntax. So what we can say is we can say each. I want to go through there and look at each of these records, and what you'll see is that there's this weird little underscore, and basically that is the record you're looking at. So you're going to look at record number 1, record 2, record 3, and you're saying, when I look at this record, look at the customer ID. So it's just kind of that in a little easier syntax. But now, let's go ahead and get rid of that underscore. So because this is so common that you're looking at records, but now you just want to look at one field, that the underscore is optional. But still, you're looking at the field of a record instead of the whole record itself. Now, here's another example that I want to add column. And as I add a column, I have a first name and a last name, but let's go ahead and add a calculated column for display name. And if you go through the tool and you basically say add custom column like I did before, this is the type of M code that they're going to emit for you. They're going to have an each, They're going to have these things inside. So now I have a new column named display name, and it simply goes row by row. And for each row, it finds the first name, last name, puts a space in between, concatenates them together. Now, most of the time when you use this, you're working with a table. So you're looking at a record and you care about one field. Okay, here's another scenario. And in this scenario right here, I don't have records, but I have individual strings. So it's not something that has a sub-object, it's the thing itself. So now when I go through this, if I do list.transform, and now I say each text.upper, and so that refers to the item itself, the underscore. Not very readable, but once you understand what the underscore means, it is the item that we're looking through, and it goes through, enumerations of item 1, item 2, item 3, and so on. Okay, everyone's having fun so far. I can tell that. Let's go ahead and look at some of the other things that we can do with M code. So here is an example where, let's say that when I'm here, I have a value of 124. But when I go here, I want this to be, the sum of these two inside here. Okay, now, first of all, you're going to say, why would you ever do this in M, where we could probably do that much easier in DAX? And that's a pretty good argument. But there could be cases where you want to calculate a running sum and you want to stop at some point. Or there just could be cases where you want to do it in your M code.
Because you can't write DAX.
Yeah, I can't write DAX, but I can write M code. That would be one good example. So if I say list.range, what we can do is we can basically figure out, what the sales are, but also automatically you get an index. So when I look at a row in a table, it's going to give me an index. If it's the first item, it's going to be 0. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, when I get to this place right here, what we'd like to do, to find this value, is basically to take all those values and sum them together. So once again, this is something you could not do working through the UI. You'd have to write M code, if you want to basically sum up things across rows inside there. Now, when we work with M, there is the Power Query language reference that talks about getting started. It's a kind of a geek document. You'd have to kind of be a developer to really want to look at that. But then there is a second thing, which is the M function library. So let's look at some of the M functions inside there. So let's say that I want to pull data back from an OData feed inside there. So now we can go ahead and put in something. And now when we get to this OData endpoint, what is the name of the entity? It is customers inside there. And what are the columns I want to keep? So now I put this together and I say table.select columns, and I put the columns to keep inside there. Okay, and then I want to select rows. And notice that here with my M code, I've kind of kept the variable names so they don't have spaces, so we don't have to have the pound sign and the the open quote inside there. Okay, now OData .feed is something that makes a call to get metadata back and then makes another call, to actually get the data. So it turns out that web.contents is more efficient than using odata.feed, but now you're going to have to know more about OData. So here's an example where I call into this API, and I have to know enough that when I call into OData and I want to get just the columns I want, we can say $select, here are the columns that I want. I can also put filtering inside there. So if you use odata.feed, it can basically get query folding, but it's going to have to make an extra round trip to get the metadata before it can discover the query folding. So some people like this, because it's a single round trip, you have to know more to kind of write the expression inside there. But once again, if you know how to make an OData call to get back just the rows and columns that you want, that's going to be more efficient as it goes inside there. Okay, now the next thing we're going to talk about, is the reason that some of you might be inspired to go actually, work with this M code. This notion of a query function. Now, query functions are simply a query that takes a parameter inside there. Now, let me, show an example. So, I've got this data, and let's go back here, And inside here in data, I've got a couple different, basically unstructured text files. They have some data inside there. Now, what I want to do is let's open up SharePoint inside here. So first of all, let me go ahead and authenticate. And now that I've done that, we're going to go to Portland embed.sharepoint.com. And so let's say that my data lives inside of SharePoint. So I'm going to create a new document library. And inside of this document library, we're going to put some data files. Now, in our case right here, I'm going to turn the sound off because generally it means I did something wrong. Let's go
really
ahead.
wants you to set your time zone.
What's that?
It really wants you to set your time zone.
It does, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to give into it. So let's create this new document library, and I'll just kind of call this data. It's going to make the path a little bit easier to get to. Okay, and then inside here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 of these data files, not all 4. I'm going to put the 4th one in later. And let's go ahead and get rid of this and take these inside here. Okay, now let's say for this very first query, if I want to get something out of SharePoint, most people would think, is there a SharePoint connector? But because this lives in a document library and you need an HTTP request, we have to use web contents. So what I need to do is, first of all, figure out, what is the path. So let's go back here, and I'm going to, let's go ahead and just create a new project for what I'm going to do inside here. And as I create this new project, I'm going to basically write a query which is going to go pull data back from there. So we're going to say, I want to get something from the web. It's going to bring up this box, and I'll put this inside there. And then I need the name of the actual file. So let's say I go here because I'm lazy, and I'll just kind of copy and paste that inside. Okay, now we'll go ahead and we'll add this inside, and we'll go ahead and choose OK. So at first, it's going to say that you've never connected to this SharePoint site, so it's going to want me to connect. And Microsoft gives you a dialog where many of the choices they give you will absolutely result in failure. You have to know to pick organizational account. We're going to go ahead and sign in with my organizational account. And once I have signed in, I should be able to now get to the data. And Power BI Desktop kind of remembers this, and it's not going to ask me again, but let's go ahead and choose Connect. Now, when I look at the actual data source, here's an example of a file that maybe got downloaded from a mainframe, and I have to basically figure out, how to get the data out of the valid rows and how to ignore the rows that aren't valid. This is something where we have fixed width columns inside there. So this is 12, the next one's 12, the next one's 24. So back in Power BI Desktop, what I can do is I can say, hey, I'm dealing with a fixed width file, and the first one starts at 0 and goes to 12, and the next one starts at 13 and goes to 24, and the next one goes to 48, and so on. And now the rows that have valid data, you can see that I can see those inside there. So let's go ahead and choose Edit. And as I choose Edit, let's call this one Expenses inside here. And as we've got that inside, let's go ahead and rename these columns. So this one is going to be the date. The next one is going to be the expense amount. Going over here, then we have the expense category. And then finally, we just have a description inside here. Now, step number 1 is let's get rid of those rows that don't have valid data. So an easy way to do that is to go over to this first column and say, let's go ahead and convert that into a date. And some of these convert just fine, and some of them had nothing in there, so they convert to null, and some had strings that can't convert to date, so they're errors. So a very easy way to deal with this is to say, remove errors, and then to say, remove things that are empty, you have to do it in that order. If you did the opposite order, it wouldn't work. But now I've kind of gotten rid of the invalid rows of data. Let's now go to amount, and let's kind of move that over to fixed decimal, which is what we should do for currency. Now for category, you kind of see there's some white space before and afterwards. So what we can do is we can do a trim, which basically takes the white space off the front and back. And I don't need it in this case, but there's also a clean that will get rid of the, the non-printable characters, the things that you can't see, but screw you up every time you try to do something with the data. Okay, so let's get rid of those here, and we'll get rid of those here as well. Okay, so now, I've basically got my, first query inside here, and you can kind of see that, I didn't really have to work with the advanced editor, but I've got this work done. Now, for this demo, I'm going to create one more query, and this query is going to use SharePoint. So I'm going to say, create a query, and with this, I'm going to pick SharePoint inside here, so there is a SharePoint connector, and here, I want to pick SharePoint folder. Now, you saw that earlier, when I went to this SharePoint site, it basically queried me for credentials. Let's go back here. And when I do this, I'm going to put this SharePoint site in. But what you're going to see is that I have to add in the credentials again, because before I was using the web, the web content, and now I'm using one of the SharePoint connectors, and they don't basically, share credentials. So now here I'm using an organizational account, but just for fun, they go ahead and switch it to Microsoft account just to confuse you. But now we'll go through, and once I've logged in here, then I'm going to be able to use any of the SharePoint connectors, and they'll already have my credentials cached inside there. Okay, now here, when I pick the SharePoint folder, what it really does is it basically does a site-wide search. And just to verify that, let me go ahead and choose edit right here. And let's go back to this site for a second, and let me go to a different document library, and let me find some other file inside here. So I can go here to slides, and let's kind of take a slide and add this one inside. And so now that we've added this other file inside, and there it is, let's go back to our query and refresh my query. And what we're going to see is that it's truly doing kind of a site-wide, looking at every single document library and every file inside. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the folder path, because now this tells me exactly what document library it's coming from. And now I can filter and say, don't find things in any other document library other than this one. And SharePoint is one of the things that supports query folding. So that will basically send a request and not bring back data about all the files. It will just bring back files for this one thing inside there. Now for later in the demo, I need a file path to each one of these files. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pick a folder path. I'll come back over to this side right here where I have the file name, and I'll just basically select those two. And then there's something where I can say remove other columns. And then I just have those two. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of combine these two together. Now, it doesn't matter which is on the left, which is on the right. It matters which one I select first. I select this first, then I hold down either Control or Shift, select the second one. And so now we're going to basically do a merge columns together. What's the separator? None. What is going to be the name when I'm all done? And that is going to be file path. And now I basically just have one thing that's a file path. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and change this to expenses. And I'll change this to expenses 2 for a second, so I can come back and take the other query. Remember, this is the one that actually does the work to take the data and basically process it and put it. I'm going to change that to get expenses. Now I'll come back to this one, and I'll just call this one expenses. Now here is where we're going to create a query function. And when I create a query function, I'm going to have to go into the advanced editor. And the way that we create a query function inside here is just by going to the very top and putting in a parameter list, open and close paren. And then I put the arrow operator, which is the equal sign. And so inside here, we're going to say file URL. It's optional, but it's good to kind of say as text, so you kind of imply what type. So now that we've done that, I'm going to take this parameter and let's get rid of this hard-coded file path inside here. So the idea is we're trying to make this so that I can use this function and call it repeatedly and just pass a different file path, and it's going to give me a different result each time. Now, the good news is it's really powerful. The bad news is once you create a function query, you can no longer use the UI experience. So basically, the advanced editor is all you got. So the recommendation is do as much work as you can before you convert it, into the function query. So you kind of see that I've already done all my logic here. I just basically made it, into a function query at the end. So now that we've done that, let's go back to the first query that has the file paths. So what I'd like to do is for each one of these files, I'd like to go ahead and call that function query and pass the file path inside there. So the way that we're going to achieve that is by going to add column. Once I get to add column, I'm going to say I would like to invoke a custom function. So now, what is the column name? And it doesn't really matter what I call this, so I'm just going to call it expense expand. We're going to get rid of the column. The column name is going to disappear before the end. But now, what is the query function? And so for every query where I've added one or more parameters, it shows up as a query function. So we'll go ahead and pick that. And because I've defined one parameter, it says pick one of the columns in this list, and there's only one, and have that be what feeds the parameter inside there. Now I'll go ahead and choose OK, and basically saying information about privacy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come through here, and I'm going to say, let's make everything public, so that these error messages go away inside there. Okay, and now it's going to run this inside here, and it's going to make me still do more stuff inside and make that public. And what I probably should have done is just gone and turned the session option on to basically get rid of those warnings. Okay, but now we have one row for each file. What we'd like to do is expand that. So now you can see that inside of that cell for each one of these rows, you have a table. And that table has multiple rows. So what we can do is we can now expand this so that we get basically one row per expense instead of one row per file. Now, when I do that, here's the data that's going to be inside there. Let's go ahead and choose OK. And now it does the expansion inside. Now, you can see that when you do this, it kind of loses the type. So I'm going to go through here, and I'm going to put the correct types back inside here. OK, and now that we have done that, and let's go ahead and change that to text. And we can change this to text. Do we need this anymore? And the answer is no. We've used this. We'll hand it its golden lock to say thank you very much for playing. We'll go ahead and get rid of that. So let's kind of finish up the demo by taking this and doing a close and apply. And so this is now going to run it on 3 files. And to kind of demonstrate this, let's go ahead and create a simple report. So we'll create a chart and we'll look at the amount. And then we'll basically take the date and have that be the access. But now we're going to kind of use that neat feature where it automatically builds out a calendar hierarchy. So I want to look at each particular month right here. Okay, so now what we have is January through September. Okay, but what's really neat about this query is it discovering what files are there. So now to kind of finish off the demo, let's go ahead and go back to that data document library. Currently, this has 3 files inside. We'll now go back to find that 4th file, and let's drop this down inside here. And now we have 4 files. I don't have to change my query logic. Let's go ahead and do a refresh inside here. And now it just discovers there's 4 files instead of 3. So pulling data together from multiple places gets to be something that once you learn how to use query functions, you're going to be able to do some pretty neat things. Think about, I have point of sale databases. I have 27 SQL databases strewn out across America. And I don't need just to get data from one of them. They have the exact same schema, but I need to basically get all 27 built into one data set. So you create a table that's got the query string for each one, And then you can do something similar, where you basically just move through and run the query against database 1, then database 2, database 3, and it all dumps into a single output table. So I've just seen most people, as they see M code is for me, I want to get into it. This typically, becomes the motivation for that. Okay, let me take a pause, take questions at this point. Anybody have questions? Okay.
You gonna make these presentation materials available?
Yeah, they've been available for a year. So at the very beginning, we have this, basically this place right here. So these slides and all the demo code is available here in this repository.
We'll get it up on the user group.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let me move ahead to where I was. Okay, so now you've kind of seen some of the basic things inside here, and finally get to query functions inside. Okay. Now, some of the other things that you can do is, let's say that you want to create a query to generate a sequence of numbers. Maybe you're doing some type of mathematical work, or you want to make some kind of sample data set. So list.generate, is one of the functions that's built in, and it accepts 3 parameters. And so the first one, is a function that takes no parameters and has a single output. They probably shouldn't have made this a function. So you pass that inside. The second thing is the item that you're looking at, and you can have some type of a statement inside there, and then we're going to say each item, is the item before plus 1. Now, one of the things that you could do is you could kind of replace the second and third parameter, with each inside there. And the idea is, let's go through each record, and the underscore, now becomes the item that you're looking at. Okay. And then also, I could split this up if I think it's more readable inside here. So you have a start function, that's this, and this just returns a 1, that's my starting point. You have a test function, let's go ahead and test, where we should stop, and then you have an increment function. So the idea is that this says start at 1, this says keep going, until your item, reaches 10. We don't want to be over 10, and this basically says take the item and add 1 for the next one. But you can kind of see that, mathematicians could do all kinds of things. If you want to create like the Fibonacci sequence or something like that, this would give you the ability to do that. Okay, who's created the Fibonacci sequence in the last week or so? Nobody? Okay, Paul has. Paul does it in his dreams. What's that?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, so we also have query parameters. And the idea of a query parameter is that you can define something in a Power BI desktop project that then can easily change. So one reason we might make a query parameter is that I don't want to hard code the database connection string, into my project, because I have this one Power BI desktop project that can look at any one of 10 different SQL databases that all have the exact table schema. So I want to kind of parameterize away the connection string. So instead of having to kind of dig into the guts of a query and find the connection string, I just basically want to set it once per project, and then inside the query you can reference the parameters inside. So query parameters get to be a big thing. Now you can use query parameters without writing M code. You can see that if I create a query parameter, I can then go into many of the dialogues and say I want to use a parameter as opposed to a hard-coded thing inside there. And then what we're able to do is come up with ways of allowing the users using the project to change the parameter. And there's different ways to be able to do that inside. But what you'll see is that parameters get to be very flexible when you are working directly with M code. Okay, I know.
What happens with the parameter if you try to publish it?
Well, parameters, if I go back a year, were only understood by Power BI Desktop, so when you publish them, they totally disappeared.
Right.
And then because of so many customers telling Microsoft, I really want to be able to control things, they now make it so that either manually, or through PowerShell or through custom code that I write, I can go and change a parameter, in a Power BI Desktop project. And what's neat about that is I can publish a PBIX file, and then I can have a piece of PowerShell that says, change the parameter that has the database connection string in it, and then go ahead and do a refresh. So running PowerShell, I could say, take my data set, not in Power BI desktop, it's already in the cloud, switch the data source and go ahead and refresh it. Those are some of the things, you know, that you can do with that inside there.
They're using Power BI API.
The Power BI Service API gives you access to parameters, and also the new PowerShell support, you know, does the same thing. But it's supported in both. You know, I would use the Power BI API.
I think this is one reason that a parameter needs to have a default value so that it can run even if input isn't provided.
That's correct. Well, there's a default value. I think you have to provide a default
Yeah,
value when you
the
add them inside
default and a
there.
current.
So there's some fallback
Yeah.
that it needs inside there. Okay, given the time constraints, I think rather than covering more material, why don't you just kind of open up to a couple more questions about things that we've covered here? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so recently I made an M function to do a select from multiple databases with the same structure. That worked great in desktop, but when I tried to deploy that with Enterprise Gateway, Gateway didn't like it. Is there a trick to getting an M function that iterates through multiple sources to work with Gateway?
Yeah, I've heard of many problems that
Yeah.
people have had. You know, I can't speak to one specific issue that I've heard about that solves that particular problem.
Okay.
You know, some of them have to do with privacy.
Do you add all the data sources in the gateway? Each server? has a
Yeah,
VPN source?
yeah. So the data sources work if I don't use an M function, if I just like
Individual.
code for each of the 10 data sources, that works. But if I,
Once you try to string them all together with function and basically enumerate through all at once, it fails.
yeah, then
You know,
Gateway doesn't
off
like
the
it.
top of my head, I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
and
even-
the core problem is probably that the formula firewall doesn't trust
Yeah.
the connections, and it has to do with privacy and authentication. And the formula firewall has all kinds of rules about
Okay.
whether or not connections should be trusted. There isn't a silver bullet answer to the question, but that is probably the core issue that you're experiencing.
But
Wants to be
it's
balanced.
possible, there's just a niche trick to
Well,
the situation.
If,
The niche trick would be hire Chris Webb as a consultant.
well, if there's like a case mismatch in the server name or something like that, if those server name and database name strings don't match exactly, you're going to get a gateway problem.
Yeah. I mean, for those of you who haven't dealt with privacy of the firewall rules, you know, the problem comes down to you have two different data sources. So you go query data source one, you get back a bunch of customer names, and then you send a query with all those customer names and a where clause to something else, and all of a sudden the other thing is, oh, look at all this customer information, this is great. You know, so it kind of errs on the side of being conservative and locking things down. You know, so the firewall rules are really tough to understand, and you know, that's definitely something where Chris Webb has said the only blog entries that have put any reasoning around how those work.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe one more question. Anyone have? Did you have a question? Go ahead.
Like for the recursive functions, or if we want to write tail recursive functions for M, is it feasible or
Yeah,
not?
M does support recursive functions,
Yeah, I mean,
and if you look at the M language specification, they have an example of using recursion inside there. You know, so you're able to create a function that calls itself. You know, so if you want to do something like, you know, crawl a directory structure and you're using recursion to do that.
For directory structure, that helps more, I feel, that's why.
Yeah, but it does support recursion inside there. The language, you know, supports it. Okay. Well, with that, I think time constraints. Greg is kind of putting the cane on me and kind of pulling me off stage here. Greg and I have become very close, so we can make fun.